Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today for part 2 of our series called Laboratories of Democracy. My name is William Hild. I'm the Deputy Director of the Article 1 Initiative, a nonpartisan project of the Federalist Society aimed at conversations around Congress's role and its structure and restoration of its authorities within our constitutional structure. We are very excited today to be joined by two very illustrious individuals, the first of which is author of our study today. Dr. Karl T. Kurtz is a principal of Legis Matters, a consulting firm that focuses on strengthening democratic institutions, especially legislatures, at home and abroad. He previously worked for the National Conference of State Legislatures from its founding in 1975 until his retirement in 2014. He has written, consulted, and lectured widely on American state legislatures, elections, and public opinion. He is co-author of Republic on Trial, The Case for Representative Democracy, and co-editor of Institutional Change in American Politics, The Case for Term Limits. We're also honored to be joined today by the Honorable Robert Hurt. Congressman Hurt is former Congressman, Vice President of Director of the Center for Law and Government at Liberty University. From 2011 to 2017, he also represented Virginia's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives and served in the House Financial Services Committee. Congressman Hurt began his time in public service in 2001 as a member of the Chatham City Council. From 2002 to 2007, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates. From 2008 to 2010, he represented the 19th District in the Senate of Virginia for 2 years. He currently still lives in Chatham with his wife, Kathy, and their 3 sons, Charles, Clement, and John. So I'm going to let Dr. Kurtz open us up today. He's going to be presenting on a study that he worked on at the Center for Legislative Strengthening, the sort of the centerpiece of the cornerstone of our discussion today, and then we'll move to a discussion between the two of them. So without further ado.
Thanks, Will. One of the things I did not put on my introductory materials for Will that I just think of as relevant looking at this audience nearly 50 years ago, 49 years ago, I guess. I was a congressional fellow of the American Political Science Association, and so this is a program that, had it existed in those days, I would have been sitting there right where you are, and it's fun to be back in the Congress. Although, as I'll say later, I don't consider myself anymore to be expert on the Congress. And what I'm going to be doing today is reporting on a study entitled State Legislative Policy Making in an Age of Political Polarization. It was a study that I led after I retired from NCSL, and we had a team of political scientists, Gary Moncrief of Boise State University, Linda Powell of Rochester University, Peveril Squire of University of Missouri, and each of those, the 4 of us as the scholars, were paired up with veteran NCSL staff people who participated in the interviews that we did. I'm guessing this audience is basically familiar with NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, but in case you're not, let me just say that it's a bipartisan organization that serves the legislatures of all 50 states, and its purpose is to share information and ideas among the states. I'll still say we, even though I'm retired, we lobby the federal government on behalf of the states and work to improve the quality and effectiveness of state legislatures. And that's where this study kind of fits in, to try to look at what works and what doesn't in overcoming the problems of today's political polarization. The The project was funded in part by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and that has a what they call the Madison Initiative, which is, I think, a $50 million commitment to trying to strengthen the Congress and restore, improve Congress's policymaking role. And the basis on which they funded our research was that Congress is one of 51 legislatures in the United States, and perhaps there are lessons to be learned one way or another. In my introductory remarks, I'm going to focus on what we learned about state legislatures and not really make an explicit comparison with Congress. I'll reserve that for discussion and for Congressman Hurt to try to think through, all of us think through together, well, if there are some good ideas here, how might they apply to the Congress? So at the outset, let me just give you the conclusion, which is that state legislatures operate in the same polarized world as the Congress, yet most of them are still able to negotiate differences and enact policy. Actually, I'd maybe say that in a little different way. All of them are still able to negotiate differences and enact policy most of the time on most issues, which is a slightly different take. So let me say just a little bit about how we went about doing this study. Our team conducted more than 250 interviews of legislators, staff, and other participants in 10 state legislatures during the 2015 and 2016 legislative sessions. At the time that we initiated the study, as now, although obviously there was a time in between, when we initiated the study in 2014, the federal government was under divided party control, so we deliberately focused on states with divided government. So here on the screen, you can see that we had 2 states under Republican control of governor and both chambers of the legislature, Wisconsin and Tennessee. We had 2 that were under unified control of the Democrats, Massachusetts and Connecticut, and then 6 that were under divided control, Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, I'm sorry, not Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Virginia, and Maine. We also, because there are 15 states that have term limits for the legislature, we also wanted some term-limited states in our sample to see whether or not that had an impact on their policy-making capability. So on this screen, Colorado and Maine are the 2 term-limited states. So in addition to these case studies, in effect, that we did of 10 states on their policymaking process, NCSL also conducted what was called the American Legislator Survey. This was a survey sent to all 7,000 plus state legislators in the country, and it was designed to uncover their attitudes toward partisanship, the institution of the legislature, and the policymaking process. And what the survey allowed us to do was to make comparisons between states on questions like that according to different characteristics, whether it might be term limits, partisan control, or whatever. So I said I wasn't really going to be explicit about comparisons to Congress at the outset, but I'm going to violate that a little bit here. And I'm going to invite you just to call out to me what are the images that the public has of the Congress. When you get in a cab there, talk to somebody who's not in the business about what you do, and you say you're congressional staff. Oh, what do they say? Incompetent, okay. What's that? Dysfunctional, okay. What else? Yucky, Ineffective. Yeah, okay. Those are pretty much the same words I come up with. Do nothing, no negotiation or compromise, obstruction, gridlock. You didn't mention polarized, that's a hot media name and topic. So let's just start out with that, because a lot of those same words come up when you talk about state legislatures in the public's image. Public is very, very cynical, as all of you know, about the legislative process. So also, before I get into the details of the study, I want to make a point that we really, in this study, tried to differentiate three different concepts. One of them is polarization. Polarization is defined as ideologically distant parties that are internally consistent. So it's a two-part definition. That is distinct from policy making, which is the process of making laws. And within policy making, you can identify two different outcomes, I guess. One is what we like to call settlements. Others might call making a law. But we deliberately use the term settlements to emphasize that often on contentious issues, what a legislature does is find a temporary solution that they know they have to come back to in a couple of years. But it's one of the ways, sort of splitting the baby in half is sometimes just, okay, we can't find the perfect solution here, but we're just going to get things done for now. And then the opposite of settlements or policy making is gridlock, the inability to pass laws. So those two concepts, polarization and policy making, are separate from civility. Civility is the outward, the public way that the legislature or legislators operate, and obviously refers to courtesy, politeness, comedy. Now, part of the reason we were at pains to try to distinguish this is that the media and the public tend to intertwine these. But incivility and gridlock are not inevitable products of polarization. In fact, it's possible to be ideologically polarized and yet still negotiate agreements on policy, just as it is possible to be polarized yet respectful and civil. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we did find very substantial evidence of polarization. And what we're reporting here is what legislators told us. I'll get to some data about that later. And one of the first places we found this was in virtually every one of the 10 states. There was a substantial fear of primaries, especially among Republicans who feared challenges from the right, and who they worried that any effort to negotiate or compromise with the other side might lead to primary opposition from the right, often identified with the Tea Party. So the defeat of Virginia Congressman Eric Cantor in the primary, the majority leader in 2014, right? Really sent shockwaves through the Republican Party, and people in the Tennessee legislature or the Washington state legislature would point to the Eric Cantor defeat. We heard one story in Tennessee. There was a longtime moderate Republican representative there, Dennis Roach, He was a high school teacher and wrestling coach, so of course he was known as Coach Roach. He was defeated in a primary by a candidate who described himself as more pro-life than your pastor, more for the Second Amendment than Davy Crockett, and more for traditional marriage than Adam and Eve. And so every place we went, we heard stories like that. On the Democratic side, there was also a loss of moderate Democrats, not so much through primaries, but kind of as a result of both sorting and in the states where there was a very significant decline in the numbers of Democrats, particularly in the South, after the long time conservative Democratic domination of the South and the Republican takeover of that mantle. The Democrats who were left in the legislature tended to be from the inner city and the urban districts, and the result was the same as for the Republicans. There was a more homogeneous Democratic caucus that is less willing to negotiate or compromise with the other side. And a lot of the legislators told us that they thought the polarization was caused by the voters. So we're representing our people, and the voters have become more polarized. Now, political scientists in general don't agree on whether a polarized public leads to polarized behavior or whether it's the other way around, whether it's the polarized elected officials who promote the polarized behavior. But there is certainly evidence of increasing public polarization that I'll share with you here, which may be a little bit hard to read from a distance, but I think the point is fairly clear that Democrats are much more ideologically divided now than they were a decade ago. Between the three peaks on each one of those slides is the distribution in the public of liberal versus conservative opinion among Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, and then the sort of purplish color in the middle is the overlap between the two of those. And you can see that there was not much change in the 10 years between 1994 and 2004, but by 2014, the parties had gotten further apart, and that overlap in the middle had really shrunk. So there definitely has been a polarization of political opinion among the public. And let me just say that I haven't updated this since 2014. There are data about it, but because that was the start of our study and the context in which our study operated, I've stuck with these numbers, this version. So here's another fairly complicated slide that I think you can see enough of to see what the point is. Political scientists Boris Shore and Nolan McCarty used the average ideological distance between the median Democrat and Republican in each state legislature, based on roll call voting data and legislators' responses to the National Political Awareness Test, to measure levels of polarization in each legislature. So the higher the score, the farther to the right you are on the scale, the greater the level of polarization. And the Congress is this one here in red, and there's a dotted line that allows you to see the state legislatures that are less polarized versus the ones that are more, and you can see that there are a lot more that are more polarized than the Congress. And the ones in yellow on there are our 10 case study states. So you can see that there was only one state, Massachusetts, that was less polarized than the Congress. Tennessee on there is just about the same as Congress. And then the others, especially Colorado and Washington, were toward the far right of that scale. But despite this increasing polarization, both in the public and in the legislatures, we did find very substantial evidence that legislatures are still able to negotiate their differences, to compromise, and to enact laws. This was particularly true on budgets, which in any legislature, and especially in state legislatures, is the single most important bill or bills. Some of them put them all in a single bill, and some of them have multiple bills like the Congress. But it's the fundamental statement of policy by the legislature, and it's the focal point of virtually every state legislative session. There were a couple of very noteworthy states in our study where they have a joint budget committee between the House and the Senate, relatively small in number. In Colorado, the Joint Budget Committee, and in Wisconsin, the Joint Legislative Finance Committee. In Colorado, there are only 6 members of that, 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate. And they have a rule that they do not vote anything out without unanimity. So it's a really strong, it's a norm. I said it was a rule. It's just their practice. And so it demands that they find consensus in some way. Wisconsin is similar, maybe, I don't remember the exact number, it's more like 15 or 16 members, but a similar substantial influence on what happens in the legislature. So during the So we did the interviews in 2015 and 2016. A lot of interviews were people remembering what had happened in the previous session. So we found on transportation issues, particularly in Virginia, there was a deal reached on transportation in Iowa, in Washington. On higher ed issues, it was pretty common that people could work across party lines to come up with settlements on those issues. It is true, though, that on issues on which the National Party was trying to enforce discipline on their members, such as the Common Core education standards, which were hot at that time, and healthcare policy, which was also, and still is, on the front burner of state legislatures because of the enactment of Obamacare. On those sort of nationally loaded issues, we did find that it was more difficult for legislatures to come up with solutions. Well, let's move to why. What are the factors that appear to mitigate the negative effects of polarization? Well, first of all, fixed adjournment dates. 42 of the state legislatures have mandated dates of adjournment. And what this does is to force timely action and prevent procrastination, just like deadlines do for all of us in our individual lives, or at least procrastinators like me. I just got this presentation to Will about an hour beforehand, so the king of procrastinators. Part-time citizen legislatures, which is more or less true of 40 states. The legislators take great pride in, we go to the Capitol, we do our business, and then we go back home, and most of them have other jobs. And they live and work, and they spend more time living and working in the community than they do in the Capitol. And what they would say about it is that essentially back home, relationships and community, that kind of trumps politics in our everyday life. So they do take huge pride in being citizen legislators. Another factor, deadlines. Three-quarters of the states have effective bill process deadlines. So, for example, dates by which all bills have to be introduced, or dates by which committees have to take action and everything has to be on the floor. Dates by which the chamber, the house of introduction, house where the bill was introduced, has to be acted on. So there's this crossover deadline when bills have to go from the House to the Senate and the Senate to the House. Conference committees. So these are pretty, it varies the level of detail from state to state. But these deadlines do lead to more timely action. The single subject rule. There are 40 states that have such rules, and I'd emphasize some of them are more enforced than others. But why is a single subject rule important? Well, it prevents irrelevant or Christmas tree bills that complicate legislation. It simplifies the process. In my state of Colorado, for example, both Republicans and Democrats really take pride in this single subject rule, and they talk about it all the time. But actually, they had what they referred to as a slip-up in 2017 on a major bill for hospital provider reimbursement, where the rule was kind of ignored and it ended up being this broad bill. And they said, we're never going to do that again. Sort of having that exception pointed to the importance of it for them. Balanced budget requirements. Again, this forces action on the single most important bill of any legislative session. In Virginia, in particular kind of an extension of this, they take a huge pride in their state bond rating. And when it comes down to the deal-making time, that is a real pressure on the members. You're told by staff, you're told by the governor, you're told by the legislative leadership, if we don't make a deal, we risk losing our bond rating. One staffer said that is the come to Jesus factor in our legislature. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, the fair and consistent application of rules. Having that, not having a majority that rides roughshod over rules and uses their muscle to suspend rules or ignore them. Having a fair and consistent application of rules builds trusts. It's an assurance to the minority party especially that rules and procedures will be followed consistently. Other ways in which state legislatures appear to be different. Talk about committees and leaders. as in the ideal legislature, committees do most of the substantive work. In a well-functioning committee system, committees give a fair hearing to all sides, deliberate on the merits of each proposal, and allow active participation by minority party members, and screen legislation for the rest of the members. Leadership also makes a big difference. A former Minnesota legislator had this marvelous quote: "The legislative session is like a giant jigsaw puzzle. What's the first thing you do with a jigsaw puzzle? You look at the picture on the front of the box to see how the pieces fit together. Good leaders help people see how the pieces fit together." We ran across some specific examples of kind of whether these were leadership inspired or just kind of norms of the legislature. In Connecticut, for example, they have a norm that they never call the previous question. In other words, they never take a vote to shut off debate. It is always open to the minority party to continue debating if they want to. But because the minority party appreciates this so much, they don't abuse it. And so they don't end up with filibusters or delay practices. In Virginia, again, we heard a lot about the Virginia way. They take pride in that. It's essentially a norm that the state comes before, the good of the state comes before individual districts and individual politics of the members. Governors also make a huge difference, the executive. They are the single most powerful actors in the legislative process because they set the agenda, they submit a budget as a starting point, and they use their high visibility as a bully pulpit to influence public opinion. What we found when we compared governors across states and governors within states across time was that their ability to influence the legislature was heavily dependent on their personal skills and characteristics. But the big point about this was that most governors have a desire to leave a legacy, and they want to get things done, and they want to point to, this is what happened to during my term. And that desire to leave a legacy leads them to moderate their positions and negotiate deals in a way that maybe has not been true in Washington for the last several administrations. So more about attitudes and politics. We heard arguments that if the majority is close, then that moderates politics as well, because you have to keep the members together, and both sides have to moderate their positions in order to get things done. Interestingly, in all 10 states, we heard this exact phrase: "We are not D.C." So the state legislators love to compare themselves to the Congress, and it inspired them to get things done. Sort of the bogeyman of their view of congressional performance inspired them to get things done. And then personal trust, and this is probably the single most important element. When you think about it, trust is needed for many of the factors that mitigate the effects of political polarization that I've talked about, such as treating the minority party fairly, empowering committees to work effectively, developing personal relationships, and relationships between legislative leaders and government. Now, let me leave that point. So we also, I mentioned that we did this survey of all state legislators, And we asked a couple of interesting questions. One was that, do you think compromise is an essential part of the legislative process, or is it selling out? And this was a scale of 1. Score of 1 was essential, and a score of 7 was selling out. And on average, legislators scored 2.4 on this scale, which is much closer to essential than it was to selling out. There were differences between Republican legislators and Democrats on this. Democrats were significantly more likely to embrace compromise than Republicans, but even so, the Republicans' responses were much closer to compromise rather than to compromise is essential than compromise is selling out. So we also used that same question framed in a slightly or scored in a slightly different way to compare the state legislators to a public opinion poll that Gallup put out in 2014, where the question read, where would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means it is more important for political leaders to compromise in order to get things done, and 5 means it is more important to stick to their beliefs even if little gets done. And so here you can see that we used the previous question I showed you about state legislators and just grouped them in the responses that were pretty favorable to compromise and the ones that were opposed or neutral. And you can see that state legislators are much more, express attitudes much more favorable to compromise than do the general public. I wish we had data like that on the Congress, maybe, to also compare it. So, in the study, we don't find, we do find cases where legislatures got tied in knots and did in effect have gridlock. And particularly, many of you might remember the Wisconsin case in, let's see if I can get my dates right, 2011, 2012, I think, where they had the massive demonstrations and walkouts by the Democrats over a public collective bargaining bill. And it was an extremely bitter and conflictual setting. Minnesota, during a similar period, it had also had a fairly an intense, but what ended up being relatively brief confrontation between the Democratic governor and the legislature. Both of these were cases where the last item on this slide, where absolutist governors, ones who were not willing to negotiate and compromise, ended up in our view and the view of the legislators that we interviewed as it came down to them. They were the ones who created that atmosphere. So legislators talked a lot about things that they saw as increasing the polarization, and they particularly talked about the social media and the 24-hour news cycle, the inability to, in a committee hearing, to ask a question that you might just be eliciting information, or you might ask a question that implies a position that's opposite from what you have. And you've got people immediately tweeting out in the audience, Congressman Kurtz said that he was in favor of X today, and how frustrating that was to them, that the process of deliberation where all sides of an issue are discussed and there's a learning process for the legislators, they felt as if it had been subverted by the social media and the 24-hour news cycle. They also talked about campaign finance and about outside expenditures having a huge impact on the attitudes of legislators. Well, I'm going to wrap up here and sort of leave all of this to, all of the rest to discussion, and be interesting to hearing Congressman Hurt's position as well as yours on some of these issues. I've devoted my entire career to trying to strengthen and improve legislatures. I admit to being an idealist. I've spent a fair amount of my time at NCSL conducting a public education campaign to try to overcome cynicism and distrust, and to basically, the message of this campaign was representative democracy works, not perfectly, but better than any conceivable alternative. And I've worked in other parts of the world on the same subject. But I admit to having my own periods of cynicism and disappointment in whatever legislature I'm watching, and kind of getting down on the process. And back sometime in the early 1990s, I was kind of in that mode of, why am I spending my life doing this? When I had the opportunity to go to the state legislature of Rio Grande do Sul in Portugal, way down southeast corner next to the border of Uruguay. And when I walked up to the Legislative Assembly building, I saw this huge sign that said, "Povo sem parlamento e povo escravo." And I don't speak any Portuguese, so I had to ask, what does that mean? And the translation that I got was, people without parliament are people in chains. And I thought to myself, aha, that's why I do what I do. That the legislative process really is all about protecting the rights of the people. So if that little conclusion has any value to you as congressional staffers, I'm happy to leave that with you. So thanks for your time and attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Karl, and excited to open up this discussion. Of course, I'd like to first go to you, Congressman. We've heard a lot, and even Virginia itself was mentioned specifically as a legislature that has a commitment to getting things done, and you've been honored to serve in both chambers of the Virginia legislature as well as the House of Representatives here. How, hearing the results of this study, and Virginia specifically mentioned, how did your experiences align and differ with those in this study? And then also, as you moved through from State House to State Senate to House of Representatives, how did your experiences differ, and how did you have to adjust to different norms and rules?
Well, first, Will, thank you and to the Federalist Society for for putting this together. It's an honor to be with all of you. As was said earlier, I served in Congress for 6 years and was in the state legislature for 10 years before that, and certainly have a tremendous appreciation, probably more than some of the comments that you get, yuppies, whatever. Probably more so than most people. I really appreciate what you all do, as especially on staffs, in staffing committees and staffing members' offices. because obviously the work that does get done can't get done unless you have folks who are willing to pull. I'm so glad to be a part of this panel because after reading through the report that Dr. Kurtz put together, it brought me back to January 2011 when I first got to Washington after having served in the House of Delegates in Richmond and then 3 years in the state Senate, which in and of itself was fascinating to see to have a rare view of what it's like to be in the House and then go to the Senate and see the differences between the two bodies in the Virginia General Assembly, but then to come here and to see how differently Washington operates than Richmond. I can't speak to any other state legislature, but it's interesting to me that there is a common feeling there among the legislatures across the country. I will also say this, and this speaks, I think, to what the Federalist Society is doing here with the Article 1 project. We think about what are our greatest challenges going forward as a nation. I would suggest to you that federal debt is a big issue, something that certainly the younger generation needs to be very, very concerned about. It could be existential. You think about challenges from our foreign adversaries. You think about North Korea. You think about Iran. You think about China, Russia. Those are serious challenges. But I would suggest to you, and I've said this before, that I'm not sure that there's any greater threat to the future of our country than the diminution of power in the Article 1 branch of government in favor of what we see in Article 2. I don't think our founders in any way thought that this is what we were getting. And I think when you think about how Washington operates, because of the failure of Congress to operate, it's terrifying, and it goes back to the Portuguese message. If you give away your rights as a people to govern yourselves, you are putting your liberty at risk, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House. You are taking that accountability away, I would submit. And so the Article 1 project in and of itself, I think, is critical. And I appreciate it. I would say that certainly when I was first elected in 2010 and came to Congress, I was on the Financial Services Committee. I immediately recognized the importance of the single object rule. Immediately recognized the requirements in Virginia that we adopt a balanced budget every year. Well, every 2 years, but then of course the off year is an amendment to the regular budget. Texas, I believe, still only meets every 2 years. Isn't that right? I think probably most legislatures Virginia certainly used to meet every 2 years. I think there are probably a lot of people who think we ought to go back to that. But with that said, and hence that's why we have a 2-year budget cycle. But having that balanced budget requirement, I think, is critical. I think being a citizen legislature is critical because when you have to go back and you have a real job, I was a lawyer, I'd go back, I had a practice right on Main Street in Chatham. You go back, you hear from folks. You don't forget who you work for under those circumstances. I'm not sure that works for Washington today. Because of the size and scope of the responsibilities, but why shouldn't we be asking those questions? Two other things, real quick, and then that I'll mention. This is a funny experience that I had when I first got here. I had been on the Courts Committee in the General Assembly of Virginia, both in the House and the Senate, and at the beginning of the session, you would get your docket. I mean, all the bills would have been filed. You know what is on the docket, with special exceptions. If the governor sends down a bill, there might be some exception made by the speaker to allow a bill to be introduced after the deadline, but it's very, very rare. I'd have a docket. I knew when the Courts Committee met. We had more bills than any other committee in the General Assembly. So when I got here, I looked forward to being on the Financial Services Committee. Went up to the chair of to the committee offices and sat down with some of the staff. Just wanted to figure out what I was going to be doing on the Financial Services Committee. I wanted to know, what days do we meet, because I want to make sure that I got that on my calendar. Well, we don't meet on a regular schedule. So what do you mean you don't meet on a regular schedule? How do you get through your work? When do you meet? I said, well, just when the chairman calls. Okay. Well, do you have a docket of the bills that I can look at? Because I want to go ahead and start reading them. Can you imagine a legislator actually reading the bills? I said I wanted to go ahead and read. When I was in the state legislature, we would read all the bills. You'd try to get a head start on them on the weekend. I'm sorry, we don't have a docket. I said, what do you mean you don't have a docket? How do you know what bills are coming up? Well, we know they're coming up when the chairman says they're coming up. That's how we know. Well, that told me that maybe some work wasn't getting done here in the committee process in Washington. In Virginia, the committees were where all the work took place. I mean, it really was. And while there's a lot of good work that gets done in committees now, it's not the same at all. Legislating is in Richmond was really a verb. Here, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's not what we do in committees. It's not legislating. And I would suggest to you one of the points that was made about having the nonpartisan staff. In Virginia, you'd have staff members on the courts committee who'd been there for 30, 40 years. I mean, they knew the history of every piece of statute in the Virginia Code, and they knew how it got there, why it was there. They didn't have a partisan axe to grind. They weren't just coming up with talking points. They really were there to serve you, and if they ever became partisan, they'd get fired. They served regardless of what party the chairman was. That's kind of fascinating when you compare that to the way things are done in the committees now. And this is another point. I don't know if you found this, but in Virginia, the committees were appointed in the House side. The committees were appointed by the Speaker. The Speaker she appointed every member of the committee, Republicans and Democrats. Whereas in Washington, the minority leader appoints the committee members for the committee, and then the Speaker, through that process, appoints the majority members. So as a consequence, if you think about how that ends up, how committees end up over the years, if you have a Speaker who for one party, who is putting on Democrats for his majority committee, regardless of who's in power, that in a way you end up bringing the committees closer together than having members that are pushed apart, which is something that only occurred to me after I'd been here for a while. But I always thought that was an interesting difference. Finally, I would just say this about following the rules. I mean, the rules are there to protect everybody. They're there to move the business. I think the fact that in the state legislature every bill gets a hearing, so there's accountability on every single bill. Here, everything just gets obfuscated. I mean, if you put in a bad bill, you put in a good bill. There's never any chance unless you are in that tight clique at the top of the party or at the top of the conference. And it's the leadership both in the majority and the minority. It's not just the majority. They control what comes out of the committees. They control what comes through the floor. Last point I'll make about the rules is, and I think that allowing any member to stand up and debate for an unlimited period of time, well, you'd think, oh, well, gosh, somebody would never stop talking. That's actually not how it works, because people do get sick of it. And the Speaker Howell always had he had one person he would call on after he'd heard enough. And frankly, most people had heard enough. We have 100 in there. We've got stuff we got to do. You can keep talking about it, but at some point, the Speaker, and I don't ever remember him getting called down for it, he would look at Terry Kilgore and he'd say, delegate from Scott County, would you call, and he would give him a signal, and then he would know it was time to stand up and call a question and stop the nonsense. The abuse of the privilege, and so it worked, and to that point, in Richmond, we had a rules committee that came up with all the rules for everybody. We all had to follow them. Here, as you all know very well, the rules committee sets its own set of rules for every single bill. Now, how is that applying the rule fairly for everybody? And what do we do, of course, in the Rules Committee here in Washington? Well, you control the amount of debate that can be had on each bill, and you control the number of amendments, which seems to me to be highly undemocratic. But it goes back to pushing that power up to those 5 or 6 people that are in leadership at the top on both sides. And I'm not sure that's healthy. So those are some of the things that occurred to me during my time here. I see Hallie Pence, who worked for me when I was here. She works now for my good friend Ben Klein, who represents the 6th District, which is Bob Goodlatte's old district. But I served with Ben in the state legislature. We were on the Militia, Police, and Public Safety Committee when I was in the House of Delegates. But it was funny. I saw him recently. And granted, he has been here about 8 or 9 months, I guess. But he said, man, he said it is crazy to come up here to Washington after having been in the state legislature and see how messed up it is. And I said, man, I feel your pain. It takes me back to January 2011. So there you have it.
And Karl, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that, but I wanted to ask before we move on. You kind of touched on it there right at the end, Congressman. With, there's a significant portion of people both in the House of Representatives and the Senate here who did serve either in one or both of the chambers of their state legislatures. Did you find that there was a cultural difference with those folks? You just mentioned a friend of yours that was also kind of struggling at sort of the differences between the two. For those folks who'd come, whether from the Virginia or from any other state legislature, was there sort of like, hey, why are we doing it this way versus some of the norms that were common in their state legislatures?
No, absolutely. I think it was most pronounced for those of us that were from Virginia, just because that was it's so much easier to talk about our shared experiences. But I do think that if you had enough people who had that experience, who were willing to say, we need to think about how we do things up here a little differently, because what we're doing here is not working. Maybe there is hope for making some of these systemic changes that I think probably need to work for Congress to finally start earning what it's being paid, because currently it's not, and I think that's regrettable. And again, what it does is it just wholesale cedes all that power that our founders gave to Congress. Our founders gave this body, the self-governed, and that's not to say the president, of course, is elected, but we all know the accountability in the executive branch is zilch compared to the accountability in the Article I branch. We have 535 people get elected on a regular basis. They've got a job interview every 2 years and every 6 years.
Great. Well, Karl, I saw you making some notes, so I definitely want to give you an opportunity to respond.
I'm not sure I'll respond other than I'm really interested in hearing from people in the audience. I do want to say at the outset, when you compare Congress to state legislatures, they do operate on a different scale. And, a Minnesota congressman who'd served in the legislature put it this way: there are 201 legislators in Minnesota compared to 535 in Congress. 5 million people in my district when I was in the Minnesota legislature compared to 300 million. And those are actually big numbers for state legislatures. Your district in the legislature and the House of Delegates.
Oh, and the House of Delegates was probably 70,000.
Right, and that's much more typical. So there is certainly a difference in scale, and it's not necessarily easy to move some of the things that work in state legislatures into Congress. And part of what that scale means is it has to do with personal relationships. There was a Tennessee congressman who told us that when he had served in the Tennessee legislature, he knew every member of the legislature, both parties. And he said, I don't even know he was a Democrat. He said, I don't even know most of the Republicans on my most important committee. And we just don't interact across parties. And that, yes, that's maybe a result of scale, but I think that's more a result of polarization and conflict.
Well, I did have one question. Was there you listed a number of structural and cultural norms, well, both structural rules and cultural norms that were cited in helping to overcome polarization. Was there one? One you would say, if there was like a most cited?
There's no magic bullet.
Okay.
I think it's a combination of some of those things. If you put them together, if you combine adhering to a set of rules for everyone for all bills, you combine that with a single subject rule and a deadline system, put those all together, then you can go about making change. Any one such change probably would not make all that much difference.
Well, on that pessimistic note, I'm actually going to give Congressman the same question. If they're coming from the Virginia legislature, and you mentioned a number of different differences between there and here in Congress, if you had to pick one reform that you could make that you here in Congress that you think would improve the situation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a rule. If there's a cultural norm, as Karl mentioned, the personal relationship.
The first bill that that we voted on when I was first elected with that wave election in 2011 was the balanced budget amendment that Bob Goodlatte had introduced. I think he introduced it every single year he was in Congress. And so I love the idea of that. Obviously, you have to account for special circumstances because obviously, especially as it relates to national defense and those sorts of things. But I think bringing that kind of discipline would be, we ought to be able to do that. When I think of how these things change, of course, so much of this, the little things that I was talking about that are huge things, are driven by the conference rules. And so, and could be done, if you had leadership that got elected and said, we're going to change the way, if it was a contract for America type thing, where you had legislative reform being a part of that, and you said, if we get elected, we're going to do things a little different. We're going to push this power down. We're not going to have so much of it concentrated. You could accomplish a lot of those things by simple rule changes. But what that means is those folks at the top of the leadership structure in the Congress they'd have to give up some control and some power, and nobody wants to do that. But if you had a big wave election, which it's kind of hard to see that we'll see that in the next couple of cycles, but if you had something like that, I think that would be an opportunity to actually maybe put in some of these reforms. And I think a study like Dr. Kurtz's would be really helpful in conversation.
In your experiences in the Virginia legislature, was there ever a time? It sounds like you experienced a number of different cultural norms and legal structures there that aided that body's ability to get things done. Were any of them adjusted or improved upon while you were there in a way that, in other words, you mentioned you might need a huge wave election before the leadership in Congress might relent. Did you feel that there was a lower bar, shall we say, at the state level to get some of these structural reforms done if there was a need recognized?
Well, we struggled mightily, and I think that it happened after I left, but it's something I felt really strongly about. For the longest time, the committees, every bill gets a hearing. Well, what does that mean? It means you got to get up early, you got to stay up late. We'd stay in committee until past midnight. You got a lot of work to do. And interestingly, when you did that much work, you ended up with having Republicans and Democrats working together most of the time to either kill a bill or to save a bill. And on the courts committee, we were always working with the specific language because that's what the cop was going to have to use when he was making a charge. It was that the language was that important. Now here staff does everything. And legislators are not so hands-on in terms of the actual language that was used. But as a part of that process, we had what I think was a bad system where every bill would get a hearing, but it wouldn't be a recorded vote. That's kind of cheating, don't you think? I mean, you work really hard to get elected, and you don't want to be held accountable for your vote. I mean, why run for office if you don't want to be held? I understand. Everybody understands that it's difficult, but that's what you got elected for. That's what you ran for. And so, and I think this happened after I was in the Congress. But then even those subcommittee meetings that met at 7:30 in the morning, and there would be 3 people that would show up. You had to have, and there might be 3 members on the subcommittee. Everybody had to be recorded, and so I thought that was a very good step, and maybe that's an example of a.
Got it. Well, I've got a ton more questions, but part of the point of this panel is how much work you guys have to do, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'm going to cut over to that, if that's all right. Is there any questions from the audience? Got one over here.
Unlike in Congress, state legislators have a broader range of topics that they can legislate on. Does that have any effect on the ability to get compromises maybe on one subject, which leads to a compromise on another subject?
And real quick, I'm just going to repeat the question so we get it for the recording. I believe your question was, given that Congress covers a lot more issues than sometimes it gets handled at the State House, did that lead? Nope, I've got it wrong. Please repeat.
So Congress is of enumerated power, states are of general power.
I see.
So states can they can legislate on more topics. So does that help foster compromise?
Got it.
Why don't you go ahead on that? Because I was forming an answer to a different question.
I think so. And the reason I think so is because you have much more mundane issues that you have to deal with. You have to deal with, what does a teacher get paid? What color is a school bus going to be? I mean, those are the things that you have to, and so they necessarily lend themselves to a much less ideological battle. That doesn't mean that they can't be. If there is a way, legislators will often find that way. But generally speaking, I think that there's more opportunity because of the granular work that has to necessarily be done by the legislators themselves. I mean, the legislators you all, for those of you who haven't worked in a state legislator's office, a staff, a congressional staff might be 20, 25 people. In the state legislature, you've got basically a secretary and some who is sort of the legislative aide for everything. In the session, you get one more person that you got to share with somebody else.
Or in many states, none whatsoever, no staff at all. So, but I was going to come at your question from a little different angle, and I'm not sure it works because I thought you were talking about more tendency to specialize by the members as opposed to, you were talking about constitutional enumerated powers versus in the states, it's, all powers not reserved to the federal government. I'm not the states have a narrower scope too, though, in the sense that they don't deal with foreign policy or war or anything of that sort. So, that immediately wipes a lot of things off the agenda. But to the extent that legislators, whether it's in Congress or state legislatures, to the extent that they specialize on a particular issue, whether it's their committee assignment potentially, then I think that makes them less able to negotiate and compromise across other issues.
More? Yep.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by the comparison between state legislatures and the U.S. House. Well, ages ago, I did an internship in the U.S. Senate. When I came to the Hill as a real staffer, it was on this side, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And one thing that became clear to me after I've been there about a month is that, and this occurred to me, we were talking about the Rules Committee and its role, that in the rules of the Senate, U.S. Senate, are set up to protect the minority party, whereas the rules of the U.S. House are set up to pulverize the minority party. which actually makes certain sense. If you go back to the framers and how they thought of each house, the House of Representatives being the people's body, and the Senate being a differently elected, more elite, elected by state legislatures, that makes a little bit of sense. So I guess my question is, well, what do you think? If we bring the U.S. Senate into the zone of comparison, how is it more or less like a state legislature? How different to the extent it's different from the U.S. House, does that difference serve a purpose, or does the Houses we have to serve a purpose?
Well, I guess I'd raise the question whether you're talking about the classic version of the Senate or today's version of the Senate.
We're seeing the Senate getting houseified as filibuster rules get
right, and more willingness to bend the rules to meet the goals of the majority, and which was true of both sides, and that's not a criticism of Republicans.
Still not the rules committee where you're literally
Right.
The majority gets to make up the rules on a
Right.
bill basis. They still have it
Right.
in there.
Well, for those of you who have the study on pages 25 and 26 of it, we have the results of our interviews with about 15 members of Congress who had previously served in legislatures. And there are some things that bear on that. Actually, your former Majority Leader, Morgan Griffith, when you served in the House, was really outspoken on, he said that about the rule, having rules for each bill. He said, I'd much rather have a rule that all the members have to stay on the floor during debate and until the business is done. And he said that would be a much more effective way of controlling amendments if you force the members to be on the floor than restricting them via rules. And I think there's some Senate relevance to that. Another former state Senate Majority Leader who's in the Congress said, we should conduct open debate on all issues. What would be the harm? Yeah. And so that, that leadership control to the extent that it exists, I think is negative for the deliberative process.
I can't, it's hard for me to speak to the U.S. Senate dynamic as it relates to these issues. I will say, in my humble opinion, I think that the cloture rule is a terrible rule, because I really do think that majorities get elected for a reason, and that there are other countervailing forces that require the Senate to have the longer view. One of them being that, and you mentioned this, I think, one of them being there are only 100 of them, and they do get along better, and they do know each other on a first-name basis, and they spend a whole lot of time after hours together in ways that does not happen on the House side. That's much more like the House of Delegates, because of course we had 100 members there. We had 40 in the Senate. When I was in the Senate minority, which was not a pleasant place to be, being in the minority, but when I was in the Senate minority, our conference was 19 people. And you were talking about tweeting out conversations during meetings, and how to, in the House majority conference, you'd have members tweeting out things that were coming out of the conference meeting before we even voted on anything. And so, but there is some camaraderie, I think, and seriousness of purpose that comes along with a smaller body, and that certainly makes a difference, I think, in trying to resolve issues.
I think we've got one back there.
Well, so just I feel like the thrust of the presentation today is what sort of lessons can Congress learn from the states, and I think you have a great list of them, but did you ever discuss with these members, or just, I'd like your thoughts on sort of the version thing. It may be very difficult to turn Congress more like states because of the different scope and all these things we talked about. What about moving power from Congress back to states and letting them use their natural benefits instead? So sort of reviving federalism as an option as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. Give me the question. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Well, and NCSL has always been a strong advocate of the states having their role in expanding their role in the process, and so the more problems that can be solved at a smaller local level and fit to the needs of each state, the better. But, that isn't to say that there aren't quite a number of really overarching issues on which the Congress rightfully can and should act. I think that the state legislature's continuing ability to get things done is a reason to turn things back to the states. But I don't take a inflexible and wooden approach to that.
I think the federal government has gotten too big, far larger than it was ever intended to be. Some of that is by necessity, but again, I think, I just agree with Dr. Kurtz. I think the more you're able to get the powers and instruments of government closer to the people, the better off you're going to be.
Before our next question, I'll just do a quick plug for Article 1. We've got a great video up on the pros and cons of the 17th Amendment, which kind of speaks to that question. So I know we have somebody who's been very patient back here.
You mentioned state balanced budget amendments. Of course, the vast majority of states have some form of a balanced budget amendment in place, but of course...
All but one.
All but one, right. But of course, so many states do not balance their budgets. So many states have mounting debts. Which balanced budget amendments would you say are the most successful, and how much of that has to do with specific language in those provisions versus polarization dynamics?
Yeah, and that's a good point. That in most states, the capital budget is separate from the operating budget, and so yes, there is long-term debt that comes out in the capital budget, but I still think that treating the operating budget as something that has to be in balance is a very effective force to bring about action and to have that constitutional requirement.
Yeah, and the Virginia Constitution requires it. And to say that to have a balanced budget requirement doesn't mean that you don't have debt. That's why our bond rating is so absolutely sacred to us and to every state, because that dictates what you can borrow money for. But you have to be able to borrow money to build schools, to build roads. Those are things that you can't just pull that out of the operating budget. But there's no reason that you can't balance your budget and not run deficits. The deficits are since I've left here, since I've left Washington. It's not all on me, but it's we're watching them just continue to grow larger and larger every year. And when you think about your children and grandchildren, our grandchildren, it's scary to think about how all of this ends.
We had one over here.
Yeah, so my question is actually on the 17th Amendment. Do you guys think it'd be beneficial to repeal it? And if so, do you see a path forward for actually doing that? Or do you think public support would never?
Oh, I don't think there's any way to do it, but I've long been an advocate, and I think it's a great thing. One of the big reasons why it was enacted in the first place was there was a perception, and maybe it was reality, I wasn't around at the time, of corruption in Congress, and that the Senate was up for sale. I don't think that is nearly the case today in state legislatures, so I don't think you'd have the same kind of problem. But I think it'd be great if senators represented represented more state government than and we've got a lot of U.S. senators who at any given time are spending most of their time getting their names mentioned for president, which I think affects the functioning of that body.
So, what if state governments were to create an office for state lobbyists to represent them in Congress?
They have
Would you
them.
like that idea?
Virginia has one.
Well, most governors have hire lobbyists here in Washington, D.C., so in that sense it exists. It wouldn't be the same as having a vote.
Yeah, and I don't think that you could ever really politically get away with undoing the direct election of senators. But you have to ask, because when you think about one of the things that we used to talk about all the time were unfunded mandates. You wouldn't have those if you had a Senate that was looking after the interests of the states because of the political implications. So, I think it'd be kind of hard to get that toothpaste back in the tube, but I wish we could.
More questions? Nope.
Just a curious observation, on the polarization of the different state legislatures. California was way off in the end. And California also happens to have very, very large legislative districts. Their Senate districts are almost 1 million constituents, and their state assembly districts are almost 500,000. So does the distance from the constituents as well as the resources needed to get elected to one of those seats, did you look into that at all, how those types of issues would affect polarization?
No, we didn't look at that, but you're right. The California State Senate legislative districts are bigger than congressional districts population, and it does affect the functioning of that body. For one thing, it means they have comparable staff to members of Congress. So a California state senator probably has 20, 25 staff people if that person is a committee chair in particular. Yeah, I mean, that kind of promotes the congressional style of doing things where you've got gatekeepers. You can't see the member without somebody unlocking the key to the door, and you compare that to a state like New Hampshire where they've got 400 members of the House and a population of only 1 million people, so the average district is 2,500 people. You can personally know 2,500 people in your district, and when they come to the Capitol and run into you in the hall, you're going to talk to them, and they don't have any staff, so there's nobody. It affects a style. Does it affect policy making? I'm not sure all that much.
If we don't have any more questions, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here because we already opened it up to Q&A, but something you mentioned earlier had spawned a question in my mind that I'd be remiss if I let you guys go without asking. 2 of the states that you researched in this study had term limits.
Okay.
And Congressman, you mentioned that even sometimes with a wave election, the leadership that is here in Congress doesn't change. It may change parties, but the people who are the speaker and the majority and minority leaders, they've probably been around a while and may be more reluctant to make rules changes that diminish their power. Did you find, Karl, in your study of state that there was any differences in the states with term limits as to how much there was willingness to change cultural or rule norms?
Well, we actually did a study 15 years ago that was almost exactly the same structure of this study. We did it of term limits right after they were enacted they were first enacted in the early 1990s. And we found a number of things. One was that a lot of the things that were touted about term limits hadn't happened. There weren't more minorities, there weren't more women as a result of forcing turnover. But the two biggest impacts were, number one, that governors gained power because a legislature, for its expertise, relies on sharing with each member. So each member, you might know a lot about law and justice issues and financial issues, and you and your legislature rely on the farmer to help you on the ag issues or whatever it might be. And that's how legislatures have expertise. The executive has huge staffs of people and expertise to draw on. So, yeah, governors are term limited too, but governors gain power quite clearly as a result of the enactment of term limits. The other thing was that term limits didn't really change the average rate of turnover in legislatures, because in most state legislatures, 8 or 10 years is a typical term of service. Where it made a difference, though, was in the leadership. And that's what you were talking about. The chair of the Appropriations Committee or the Speaker or the Senate President is likely to be someone, absent term limits, somebody who's been around for 20 years, who really knows the process. So those were the particular impacts. In this particular study of policy making, we couldn't see that the term-limited states were all that much different from the non-term limited states, but we had a very small sample of 2. So,
Gotcha. Well, before I close, I just wanted to give you an opportunity, Congressman. Do you have any last remarks you'd like to make, or?
Only to say that I really do think that this initiative is important, and the larger initiative, the Article 1 project, because I really do think that it goes to the heart of who we are as a country, that we believe in self-government, and if we want that legacy to be handed down to the next generation, you have to preserve it, and I think that at the rate that we're going, it just looks like we're losing more and more power as an Article 1 branch, and I think that needs to be restored. So thank you for having me.
Excellent.
Thank you
Well,
all.
please join me in thanking our illustrious panelists today.